The Andes do not tolerate carelessness. At 11,000 feet, the air holds less oxygen than the human body expects. Snow conceals crevasses. Cold arrives without ceremony. The mountain range stretches along the spine of South America, indifferent to the borders drawn across its surface. In October, spring begins in the southern hemisphere, but above 10,000 feet, winter holds on. The peaks are white and unbroken. Wind moves across ridges without interruption. There are no roads here, no settlements, no trails. The distances between valleys are measured in days of walking, if walking is even possible. Aircraft cross these mountains daily, following established routes, relying on radio navigation and visual reference points. When cloud cover is thick, pilots depend on instruments and reported altitude. On October 13th, 1972, a twin-engine Fairchild FH-2-27D, carrying 45 people, departed from Montevideo, Uruguay, bound for Santiago, Chile. The flight was chartered to carry members of a rugby team, their friends and family. The plane did not reach Santiago. The passengers were young, mostly in their teens and 20s. Many were players for Old Christians Club, a rugby team from Montevideo. Others were relatives, supporters, and crew. They were traveling to Chile for a match. Most had no wilderness training. They carried personal luggage, rugby gear, some wine, and cigarettes. The aircraft was operated by the Uruguayan Air Force. The pilot and co-pilot were experienced officers. Weather over the Andes that day was poor. Cloud cover obscured visibility. The flight plan called for the aircraft to cross the mountains at a point where the terrain was lower, following the approved air corridor. But the plane turned towards Santiago too early. The crew believed they had cleared the peaks. They had not. The aircraft was still deep within the range, flying through a pass surrounded by mountains exceeding 13,000 feet. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, the plane struck a ridge. The right wing sheared off. Seconds later, the tail section separated. The fuselage tobogganed down a steep, snow-covered slope, tumbling and disintegrating as it went, before coming to rest in a remote valley high in the Andes. The valley was glacial, narrow, and surrounded by peaks. No villages existed within 50 miles. No one heard the crash. 12 people died on impact or shortly afterward. The surviving 33 were injured, some critically. Several had broken legs, fractured skulls, internal injuries. The fuselage, partially intact, provided minimal shelter. It was open at both ends, where the tail and cockpit had torn away. Snow blew in. The temperature at night dropped well below freezing. Altitude made breathing difficult. Many were in shock. Some could not move. The initial response was disorganized. A few of the passengers had minor medical training. They tried to stabilize the injured using seat cushions and luggage straps. There were no medical supplies beyond a small first aid kit. Water was obtained by melting snow. Food was scarce. The flight had carried some snacks and a few bottles of wine, but no substantial provisions. Passengers assumed rescue would come within a day or two. Aircraft frequently crossed the mountains. They believed searchers would locate the wreckage quickly. The search began almost immediately after the plane was reported overdue. The Chilean and Argentine governments deployed aircraft. The search area, however, was vast. The wreckage was white aluminum resting on white snow in a white valley. From the air, it was nearly invisible. Weather continued to worsen. Cloud cover and snowstorms repeatedly forced search planes to turn back. Days passed. No signal was detected. The emergency radio in the cockpit had been damaged in the crash. One of the survivors, a student with some electronics knowledge, attempted to repair a small transistor radio. He succeeded in receiving broadcasts. On the 8th day after the crash, October 21st, the survivors listened to a news report. The search had been called off. Authorities concluded that no one could have survived this long in such conditions. The official search was suspended. The passengers heard this while sitting in the fuselage. They were not dead, but no one was coming. The realization imposed a new discipline. Survival would depend entirely on their own actions. The environment offered nothing. There were no animals to hunt, No vegetation, no firewood. The valley was barren. Snow covered everything. The cold was constant and severe. Shelter remained the fuselage. They blocked the open ends with luggage and seat cushions to keep out wind. At night, passengers huddled together for warmth. Frostbite became common. Water was obtained by placing snow in containers and letting body heat or sun melt it. But water was not the immediate problem. Food was. The small amount of chocolate, crackers, and jam they had rationed was gone within a week. They searched the wreckage repeatedly, finding nothing edible. Starvation began to assert itself. Bodies weakened. Thoughts slowed. Movement became difficult. Some individuals began to discuss the only remaining option. The bodies of those who had died in the crash were buried under snow near the wreckage. The cold had preserved them. On the 10th day, a few of the survivors spoke quietly about the possibility of consuming the flesh of the dead. The conversation was careful. Religious objections were raised. The group included devout Catholics. But the alternative was clear. Without food, everyone would die. One of the survivors, a medical student, framed the decision in clinical terms. The bodies were tissue. The dead had no further use for that tissue. The living did. He argued that if their positions were reversed, he would want his body to be used. Others agreed. Some did not participate but did not object. The decision was made collectively, though not unanimously. On the 11th day, a small group used glass shards from the wreckage to cut thin strips of frozen flesh from a body. They ate in silence. There was no ceremony. It was described later as mechanical, joyless, done only to continue living. Over the following weeks, this became routine. Rationing was strict. No one took more than their share. The dead were treated with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. Days blurred into weeks. A routine emerged. In the morning, survivors would chip away at snow and ice to create water. Clothing was inadequate, so they fashioned insulation from seat covers and cargo materials. Some individuals took on specific roles. One managed food distribution, another organized the repair of the fuselage. A few stronger members ventured short distances from the wreckage to search for additional debris or materials. They found pieces of the tail section which contained batteries. These were carried back in hopes of powering the radio. The student working on the radio made slow progress. Components were damaged. He lacked tools, but he continued. The work gave him purpose. Purpose was necessary. Without tasks, the mind deteriorated. Inactivity led to despair. Despair led to death. Several more passengers died during this period from injuries or cold or the cumulative effects of malnutrition. Each death reduced the group further. The bodies were placed outside. The survivors spoke about them with quiet respect. They understood what those bodies now represented. On October 29th, 16 days after the crash, an avalanche struck the fuselage during the night. Snow poured through the openings, filling the interior within seconds. Survivors were buried. Panic erupted in the darkness. People clawed at snow, unable to see, unable to breathe. Some were trapped beneath others. Screaming was muffled. It took hours to dig out. 8 more people died, suffocated under the snow. The survivors who remained were fewer now, 27 in total. The avalanche changed the atmosphere. The fuselage, already fragile, felt even less secure. Snow had to be cleared from the interior daily. The work was exhausting. Altitude and hunger had weakened everyone. Movements were slow, deliberate. Speech became minimal. Energy was spent only on survival. There was no conversation for its own sake. Laughter was absent. The days were cold labor and rationed flesh and waiting. By mid-November, more than a month had passed. No rescue had come. No aircraft had flown overhead. The survivors understood that they would not be found by chance. If they were to leave this place, they would have to do it themselves. The problem was the terrain. The valley was enclosed by steep mountains. The peaks surrounding them rose to 14 and 15,000 feet. Snow conditions made climbing extremely dangerous. None of the survivors were mountaineers. They had no climbing equipment, no ropes, No crampons, no maps. They did not know how far they were from civilization. Attempts to scout the area had been made, but individuals could not travel far before exhaustion forced them back. Altitude sickness was constant. Even short climbs left people gasping. Yet a few among them began to consider a longer expedition. They discussed it carefully. The risk was clear. Whoever went might not return. But remaining in the fuselage indefinitely was also fatal. Supplies of flesh were finite. Cold and altitude were eroding everyone. The choice was between a slow, certain death and a dangerous, uncertain attempt. 3 individuals prepared for the expedition. Nando Parrado, one of the rugby players, had survived despite severe head injuries early on. Roberto Canessa, the medical student who had first proposed using the bodies, was among the strongest remaining. Antonio Vizintin, another player, volunteered as well. They spent weeks preparing. They fashioned a sleeping bag from fabric and insulation scavenged from the plane. They packed strips of meat wrapped in cloth. They made crude sunglasses from plastic to protect against snow blindness. They studied the surrounding peaks, trying to identify the lowest point of escape. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, the 3 men set out. They climbed west toward what they believed was Chile. The going was brutal. Snow was deep and unstable. Each step required immense effort. They traveled during the day and huddled together at night in the makeshift sleeping bag. After several days, they reached a high ridgeline. From there, they could see the landscape beyond. It was not what they had hoped. Instead of descending valleys and green foothills, they saw only more mountains extending endlessly to the west. The sight was crushing. Chile was farther than anyone had estimated. Vizintin turned back, conserving the group's resources. Parrado and Canessa continued alone. They walked for 10 days. The terrain gradually descended. Snow gave way to rock, then to patches of vegetation. On December 20th, they encountered a river. Following it downstream, they eventually saw signs of human activity. A trail, then cattle, then a man on horseback on the far side of the river. The man saw them. They were emaciated, bearded, sunburned, barely able to stand. The man rode for help. Within hours, authorities were notified. A rescue helicopter was dispatched. On December 22nd, 70 days after the crash, the first helicopter reached the crash site. 14 survivors were airlifted out that day. Weather forced the helicopter to return the next day for the remaining 2. All 16 were alive. They were severely malnourished, frostbitten, and injured, but alive. The ordeal had lasted more than 2 months. The story reached the public immediately. Initial reports focused on the survival and rescue. When details emerged about the consumption of human flesh, reaction was intense. Some condemned the survivors. Others defended them. Religious authorities were consulted. The Catholic Church issued statements affirming that the actions were morally permissible given the circumstances. The survivors themselves were reluctant to discuss it. They described it as the only option. They expressed sorrow but not shame. Interviews were difficult. Many struggled with trauma. Some never fully recovered psychologically. The physical recovery took months. Several required surgery. All suffered from lasting effects of frostbite and malnutrition, but they had survived. 33 of the 45 passengers and crew had lived beyond the crash. By the time of rescue, 16 remained. 29 had died. The crash site was later examined. Investigators confirmed that the pilot had miscalculated position and altitude. The aircraft had been flying too low when it entered the pass. Navigational error, compounded by poor visibility, was the cause. The tail section, located more than a kilometer from the main wreckage, contained additional supplies and the aircraft's batteries. Had survivors reached it sooner, they might have restored radio communication, but the distance and terrain made it inaccessible for weeks. The valley where they had been stranded was later identified as being more than 80 miles from the nearest inhabited area. The trek that Parrado and Canessa completed covered approximately 38 miles over some of the most difficult terrain in the Andes. Without equipment or training, they had crossed peaks exceeding 13,000 feet and descended into the Chilean foothills. Their endurance was a function of necessity, not ability. The survival of Flight 571 remains one of the most studied cases in the literature of human endurance. It illustrates the extremes to which social cohesion and discipline can extend life in impossible conditions. The survivors were not specialists. They had no survival training. What they had was cooperation, rationing, task assignment, and a refusal to surrender to despair. The decision to consume the dead is often what the public remembers, but it was not the reason they survived. They survived because they maintained structure when structure should have collapsed. They divided labor. They cared for the injured. They continued to plan even when planning seemed pointless. The psychological toll was immense. Many survivors spoke later of guilt, not for what they did, but for living when others had died. Survivors' guilt, complicated by the nature of their survival, affected them for years. Some withdrew, others became advocates for resilience, speaking about the experience in controlled, clinical terms. The Andes did not grant them mercy. The mountains offered no advantage, no reprieve. Every calorie, every degree of warmth, every step forward was taken from an environment that gave nothing freely. The cold was constant, the altitude relentless, the isolation absolute, and yet 16 people walked out, not because they were exceptional, but because they refused the alternative. The story is not one of triumph, it is one of endurance. The difference is important. Triumph suggests victory. Endurance suggests only that the person did not stop. That is what happened on Flight 571. They did not stop. When the search was called off, they continued. When food ran out, they adapted. When the avalanche came, they dug out. When the mountains seemed endless, 2 men kept walking. The result was survival. Survival is not glorious. It is simply the refusal to yield. The incident forced questions about the limits of human ethics under duress. Philosophers and theologians debated the morality of cannibalism for decades afterward. The survivors provided a real-world case where theory met necessity. Their experience demonstrated that moral frameworks designed for normal conditions do not always translate to extremes. The survivors were not immoral. They were people in a situation that permitted no good options. They chose the option that allowed them to remain alive. Whether that choice was right or wrong is a question that exists only for those who were not there. For those who were, the choice was operational, not philosophical. The story endures because it is real. It is not a myth or a parable. It happened. People died in the cold. People ate the dead to avoid joining them. People walked until they found help. The facts resist simplification. They do not conform to narratives of heroism or tragedy. They sit uncomfortably in the space between. That discomfort is what makes the story significant. It reminds us that survival is not always noble. Sometimes it is simply grim and necessary. The survivors of Flight 571 lived through something most people cannot imagine. They returned to a world that could not fully comprehend what they had endured. But they returned. That is the substance of the story. Not inspiration, not horror, just the blunt fact of return.